So I think we should begin because we have Uri's here, and it's about 10:02 Israel time, and that's where he is. So it's pretty late for him. I just feel very guilty.
No need to.
But it's really my honor to have Uri Regev with us. He is someone who's, I think, one of the great leaders of the Reform movement and of world progressive Judaism and of Judaism as a whole. And he's based in Israel. He has his son is a rabbi in North America. So he hangs out here in the West Coast periodically. And Uri created this amazing organization on freedom of religion in Israel called the Hiddush. And I've been wanting him to join us for a very long time, and I'm so excited that we can make it work today. So without any further ado, it is my great honor to invite Uri Regev, lawyer and rabbi, to lead us this afternoon, or late evening as the case may be.
Thank you very much. Shalom, and the pleasure is mutual. I am delighted to be able to share with you some updates, some background, some context on a topic which is not only of interest to you, I hope, being part of the Reform movement and part of the pluralistic Jewish world, but also to Israel, because one cannot really understand Israel without understanding the clash of religion and state, and more generally, the significance and meaning of Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. So there are plenty of topics that one can discuss when one discusses Israel. My focus is on issues of religion and state, and the topic for this session, as was chosen by your rabbi, is the battle over religious freedom and equality in Israel, law, politics, and American Jewry. So I'll try and touch all of these, and obviously, given an hour at the outset, we'll be able to do limited justice to the topic. I'll use the slides that I selected, prepared, to be able to share with you the facts, the figures behind the issues. And I sent a copy just a little while ago to your rabbi, and those of you who would be interested should be able to get it from him, so you'll have something tangible and be able to sort of think this through afterwards as well. And we'll try to leave some time for questions, comments, suggestions. So let's start. So first of all, we really want to understand who are the Israelis. You know, some people have family in Israel, they have friends in Israel, they visited Israel, and they feel that they really know what makes the average Israeli tick. So I want to make sure that you understand who are the Israelis. And one of the areas that is so often misunderstood is the gap between the question of how do Israeli Jews define themselves religiously and how do Israeli Jews define themselves politically.
Oh, I didn't realize you were listening to something.
That's all right.
I suggest you mute everybody and unmute me. Hi, Gordon.
Hello, Uri.
Well, Gordon Silverman has joined us. He is Hiddush's US representative. It's wonderful to have him on the call. All right. How do Israelis define themselves religiously? How do they define themselves politically? Without understanding that, you cannot understand what's happening in Israel in terms of the political arena, and you cannot understand why I'm not only optimistic, but I'm confident that ultimately we will prevail, we shall overcome in terms of our battle for religious pluralism and religious freedom. So when you look at the adult Jewish population in Israel and you ask them in variety of surveys, and this is one of the things that Hiddush does, And as you can see, this is from our last Israel Religion and State Index, which is our major annual survey of Israeli Jewish public opinion on all matters of religion and state. We publish it annually on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, so stay tuned. The next one will come out soon. I've just received the raw material and I'm working on preparing the report. But generally speaking, the breakdown is comparable. So when you ask American Jews to define themselves religiously, you ask them, are you Orthodox, conservative, Reform, other, or just Jewish? In Israel, it doesn't quite work that way because the streams are a relatively recent or late phenomenon in Israel and do not represent enough of the population to be able to be the key division, the key dividing line by which we understand how do Israelis define themselves religiously. That is not to say that the streams, Reform, Conservative, are irrelevant for Israelis, and later on you will see the breakdown and the level of identification of Israeli Jews with the non-Orthodox streams. So the divisions in terms of Jewish identity of Israelis as set by the Central Bureau of Statistics already some 15 years ago are you secular, Masorti, לא כל כך דתי, traditional not so religious, Masorti dati, traditional leaning toward religious, Dati, religious, or Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. These are the categories set by the Central Bureau of Statistics, and they are extremely helpful because for many years prior to that, the Masorti, the traditional sector in Israeli, among Israeli Jews, was lumped together. And this does injustice to understanding what really makes the average Israeli tick in terms of Jewish identity. So here you are. The breakdown is the following. Approximately 48% identify themselves as secular, approximately 18% as traditional, not so religious. Together, we are dealing with about 66%. And then you have 13% that identify themselves as traditional, leaning toward religious, about 11% that define themselves as Dati, which means usually modern Orthodox or Zionist Orthodox, and then about 10% ultra-Orthodox. I'm sorry if it sounds technical, but it is really essential to understand what is happening here. So I said 66%. Why did I choose to put together secular and traditional not so religious? Because as you'll see further down, the traditional not so religious tend to share views on public policy with the secular. Now, they don't feel sufficiently comfortable to label themselves secular, but on many of the public policy issues, such as public transportation on Shabbat and freedom of marriage and equal rights to the streams, etc., they tend to respond similarly or close to the secular. So about 66% are those categories, secular or traditional, not so religious. On the other hand, when you look at how Israelis define themselves politically, you have sort of a parallel breakdown, which in a minute we'll better understand, but just look at the figures first. So center are about 20%. Center right, 19%. Right and very right, 45%. And center left and left, 16%. Now, in the most recent figures, which you will see on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the center left and left is slightly even smaller. And what that means is practically 64%, 65% identify themselves politically as being right of center, compared to only about 15% that identify themselves as left of center. If you don't understand that, you do not understand Israeli politics, you don't understand what happened in the elections, and you don't understand that whereas religiously, most Israelis are on the same page in terms of holding a liberal approach that is comparable to and close to that of American Jewry, even if they don't define themselves necessarily as reform or conservative, but politically, the overwhelming majority, about 2/3, place themselves on the political right. That is why the elections have turned out the way they did. But before we get to the last elections, let's just take a look at the same division, namely center, left of center, right of center, based on how Israelis define themselves religiously. And what you can see is that the ultra-Orthodox, 83.7%, the modern Zionist Orthodox, 88.9%, namely the overwhelming majority of the Orthodox define themselves as right-wing, whereas the secular are divided more evenly. Yes, even among the secular, 43% identify themselves as right-wing, but at the same time, you have a much larger percentage that are center and left of center. So you can see the correlation between the battles of a religion and the battles of a politics, and the impact that the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, and the more traditional segment in Israeli society have on pushing for right-wing politics. You'll see the sort of ominous nature of that in a minute. So what happened in the elections? 120 Knesset members in the elections. And when you see the breakdown, you will see that the Likud got 36%, blue and white, which since then has divided, has broken down, with some joining the Likud to form the coalition, having 33, and then a number of small parties that break right in the middle. So without the swing vote that was held and is still held today by Yisrael Beitenu, the Russian Olin party, led by Avigdor Lieberman, the Likud was not able to form a coalition. Lieberman was not willing to give Netanyahu his support and the votes of his party, the 7 seats that they held. And Netanyahu was successful in breaking down blue and white, and being able to draw 15 out of the 33 to support his, one second, don't know if you, to support his coalition. So it ended out that the coalition has 73 out of the 120, which is a solid majority, if they were able to carry on a harmonious and collaborative mode of political functioning, as opposed to the opposition that has 47. I'll be glad to answer some additional questions regarding politics afterwards, but for the time being, let's move on and see and be able to focus on how all of that translates into issues of religion and state. But for the time being, just see that the coalition of 73 to a great degree, depends on the continued support of what is colored black here, namely the 9 seats that Shas has and the 7 seats that United Torah Judaism has, the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties. If they pull out of the coalition, they basically threatened the continued existence of Netanyahu's government. And therefore, he is extremely eager to keep them happy, satisfied, and well-nourished. Well-nourished in terms of funds, well-nourished in terms of concessions, such as a mass exemption of yeshiva students from military service, such as the Kotel, the Western Wall controversy, which he has suspended following their demand, etc. Now, just so that you understand, these are not issues that I am personally dreaming about, worked up over. These are issues that confront Israel and the Israeli political scene on a daily basis. So today, literally today, for instance, at the Knesset, there were debates and initiatives raised in the plenum over the women of the wall, over who is a Jew, over kashrut, the chief rabbinet's supervision over dietary laws and certification of kosher food, and over funding of the yeshivas. That's only today. So these issues are constantly on the political front, not just the political horizon, on the political front, and regularly provide for clashes within the coalition, within the opposition, and mostly between the coalition and the opposition. With the coalition trying to appease the ultra-Orthodox parties, and with the opposition knowing what you will soon see, that the general public is opposed to those demands, opposed to the concessions, opposed to the funding, and therefore the opposition regularly attempts to bite into the coalition's continued submission to the demands of the religious parties. But of course, that's the ugly face of the political game. Namely, regardless of principle, regardless of pre-election promises, regarding of the will of the majority, the coalition does what they feel they need to do in order to stay in power. And in part, and that's part of our conversation and part of the issue that you are, I'm sure, aware of, and I hope giving much thought to, namely part of the price that the Israeli governments have been willing to pay, mostly in recent years, is to basically throw American Jewry by the wayside. Because American Jewry is predominantly reform and conservative. American Jewry is growingly aware of the policies, especially on who is a Jew and the Kotel and marriage and funding and equal status to the non-Orthodox movements, etc., is growingly aware of that and resentful of that. But Netanyahu may be smiling to you, may be making appeasing statements when he's in contact with American Jewish leaders, but then he goes home and votes the way that the ultra-Orthodox demand that he votes. Now, is that a fait accompli? Is that part of the elements? Far from it. One of the challenges that I suggest American Jewish leadership has not fully come to terms with is the need to and the ability to participate in this battle, which isn't about a battle for sectarian rights. It's a battle over the soul, the character, the future of not only the state of Israel, but the Jewish people. So let's move on. And as I said before, the general public doesn't share the continued submission to the demands of the ultra-Orthodox parties and the preference of Israeli politicians. And I have to make it very clear, this isn't just about Netanyahu. Israeli politicians, left, center, and right, because for most of the years of the state, the Israeli political leaders of the time, whether they were from the left or the center, and in recent years the right, have chosen to bring on board the ultra-Orthodox parties as key partners to their coalition government, because from 1948 onwards, there was need for a coalition government because no one party was able to get the majority of the votes. So to form the government and rule Israel, you needed to bring on board additional parties. And they usually preferred not to work out the differences between left and right or right and left, but rather to buy the vote, so to speak, of the ultra-Orthodox and be able to base their majority, sometimes very slim majority, on their support. So here you are, we are running those polls, periodical polls, and then the annual Religion and State Index for years from the inception of Hiddush. And this is just a glimpse. We've been asking in March of 2019, April of 2019, December of 2019, and then February of 2020. This is election period. As you know, in the last year and a half, Israel has been forced to go to elections 3 times. And if nothing good happens in the coming few weeks, Israel will be going to yet a 4th election round, God forbid. So we have been asking the question in different ways, either now that elections have taken place or in looking at the upcoming elections, what kind of a government, what kind of a coalition would you like to see after the elections? Or would you like to see now that the results of the elections are in? And we asked the question in different ways, basically asking people to tell us where are they in terms of the 2 key options: a broad civil unity coalition, namely Likud and Blue and White, and a few other parties that are civil parties, namely not religious parties, even though they have religious members, religious voters, religious representatives, but they're not a religious party. So do you want to see a broad civil unity coalition or a narrow coalition that is dependent upon the ultra-Orthodox parties? And consistently what you see is 2/3 of the adult Jewish population says, give us a broad civil unity coalition. We have no use for a government and a coalition that depends on the ultra-Orthodox parties. That's consistent, it's clear, it's unequivocal, and of course, it's not what Netanyahu has chosen to do. Now, who are the people who are holding this view? And again, I'll just give you a glimpse. So in terms of voting, what you see is that even in the Likud, 51% are preferring a government that doesn't depend on the ultra-Orthodox. But 90% of Blue and White wants that. And of course, the Russian Olim, etc. So overall, the 2/3 that I mentioned consist of even a slight majority of Likud voters. The only ones who want a government that depends on the ultra-Orthodox are, of course, the ultra-Orthodox. And then the Orthodox, the National Orthodox Party. Now, if you look on the left, you'll see how that divides in terms of religious identity. So 82% of the secular and 76% of the traditional not so religious want a government which is civil, a broad unity civil government. And as I told you earlier, and you can see one example here, the traditional not so religious are very close to the secular in terms of their outlook. the traditional that lean toward religion are closer to the Zionist Orthodox, to the modern Orthodox. All right. Well, you can look at it afterwards, but as you know, many in Israel have been shattered, angry, disappointed, whatever label you want to attach to it, over Blue and White's decision to break from their promises not to sit with Netanyahu and to introduce a new approach to the bond of religion and state. As they say, the status quo on religious affairs has become a sign of stagnation. And today it sometimes even harms the individual freedom of some Israeli citizens and harms the status of Judaism in the country, etc., etc. You'll be able to read it more. Of course, entering into the coalition, the question is, what policies will they be pursuing? One thing that they've already promised is to support the ultra-Orthodox demands for mass exemption of yeshiva students from military service. This is an issue that is a gut issue for most Israeli Jews, something that makes people really angry. And you can see the contrast. You can see the void in this photograph, which is right outside our office in Jerusalem, or rather was, in the elections, for the elections. And you can see Gantz, the leader of Blue and White, and this huge billboard was put up shortly before the elections in order to try and bring on board more voters from their natural core of secular and traditional, not so religious potential voters. So it reads, only large Blue and White will establish a secular unity government. Clearly, they wouldn't have done that had they not felt that this is what their voters expect. And surely once the elections were over, forgotten promises, discarded promises, and that is part of what makes Israelis so angry. All right, I'll try and speed up the pace. So one question that you may ask yourselves is, do Israelis care? Do Israelis really care? So one of the things that we have been doing every year since 2009, when we started the polling, is say to the sample expanded panel of the adult Jewish population in Israel. Sorry, not panel, but sample. A scientific sample of the adult Jewish population in Israel. We tell them there are a number of domestic conflicts that the Israeli society is facing. We are not mixing the Arab-Jewish, conflict with the domestic conflicts. Which of them do you consider to be the most acute? Which of them do you consider to be the second most acute? And what you see in the conflicts that we are presenting are conflict between rich and poor, between Sephardi and Ashkenazi, between ultra-Orthodox and secular, between political left and political right, and between new immigrants and veteran Israelis. So the good news is that all the past major conflicts that threaten to tear apart Israeli society, namely new immigrants and veteran Israelis, Faradim and Ashkenazim, rich and poor, are basically gone. Now, they're not really gone, they're not completely gone, but as you can see, they are very low on the list here, basically non-existent. The two acute conflicts are between the ultra-Orthodox and secular, and between the political right and political left. And actually, as you can see in some of the years, the tension over religion and state, the tension over Haredi and secular has been the top acute conflict. But of course, the growing acrimonious conflict between left and right has brought this further up in recent years, and the two of them ride next to each other in gaining sort of the acknowledgement of Israelis. These conflicts are really tearing Israel apart. So not only is this important to Israelis, but as you can see, Israelis are on the same page as you are, on the same page as we are. When we, again, regularly every year ask the question, do you agree or disagree that the state of Israel should have freedom of religion and conscience, quoting from the Declaration of Independence? That is, freedom of choice and behavior for the secular and the religious according to their worldviews. What you see is consistently an overwhelming majority of, here you can see 84% who say, I greatly support that, or I somewhat support it. So clear majority that want Israel to be true to and loyal to the principle of freedom of religion and conscience. So for instance, when we ask about specific issues, and I won't share many of them with you because we don't have the time, but one of the major issues that is a bone of contention for Israelis is the mass exemption of yeshiva students from military or national service, as I mentioned before. And this is coming up soon because in September, the Supreme Court has set a sort of an expiration date for the existing law, and the Knesset is supposed to be coming up with a new law, and they are trying to square the circle. The coalition is trying to, on the one hand, appease the ultra-Orthodox and ensure that the new law would enable all yeshiva students to dodge the draft, and at the same time to implement the Supreme Court clear rulings in the past that say you can't break the principle of equality in such a major way that makes equality a travesty. So will they be able to square the circle? Of course they won't. So we are in for additional battles over this issue. And so where are the Israelis? So we present them with three options. Do you accept the principle that Torato Omnuto, namely the demand, the claim of the ultra-Orthodox, that the Torah is their craft, and therefore this is what they commit their lives to, and they shouldn't be forced to serve in the army or do national service? Only 20%, only 20% of the adult Jewish population says, yes, this is acceptable to us. Bear in mind, only 20%, so that is representing the ultra-Orthodox, a chunk of the modern Orthodox, and some of the traditional. Some of the modern Zionist Orthodox don't buy this and don't agree with this and say you should serve. Now, I won't spend more time, but the question is, will you all serve, or will there be what we actually are supporting, a generous quota allowed for excelling yeshiva students to continue their studies, and the rest should be doing either military service or national service? Now, this results with Israelis. Now, this is not our survey. Many other groups are doing their surveys. This is the JPPI, the Jewish People's Policy Institute, sponsored by the Jewish Agency and co-chaired by Dennis Ross and Stu Eisenstadt. So the question here is, how do you rate the contribution of the different groups in Israeli society or outside Israel to the success of Israel? Who contributes most to Israel's success? So at the top, soldiers, then secular, then the Druze, Israelis like the Druze, etc. Now, very interesting, look, diaspora Jews right in the middle. Yes, there is a lot of appreciation of the role that diaspora Jews play. Who is at the bottom? At the bottom are Muslim Arabs and Haredim, even lower than Muslim Arabs. This is really the bottom of what the average Israeli thinks in terms of who contributes to Israel's success. So this is, of course, an issue that comes up in a different setting, because there is an ongoing assault on the Supreme Court. There is the whole controversy regarding the override clause, trying to pass a law which the ultra-Orthodox are pushing for, so as to be able to undo Supreme Court rulings, because the Supreme Court is that one sort of beacon of light that the ultra-Orthodox have not been able to subvert. So the politicians, whether from the right or in support of the ultra-Orthodox, are saying, yes, the Supreme Court has turned Israel into a legal tyranny, etc. Again, we don't have time to go into it. So we, a number of times, ran a survey, and there are parallel surveys that were done, for instance, by the Israel Democracy Institute and others. We asked the question, which of the following institutions do you have the highest confidence in? So the sad news is that 37% say we have no trust in any of these. Extremely disturbing. Now, I don't know that it's that different in America today, but this is really a sad statement about the nature of democracy and the way that the Israeli politicians have ran democracy into the ground, so to speak. But here is the relative role or the relative level of trust of the others. So 36%, the highest, is in the Supreme Court. And then, of course, you have the bottom. The bottom of the bottom is the Knesset. And then close to it, the government, and close to it, the chief rabbinate. No love lost and no significant trust given to either the Knesset or the government or the chief rabbinate. And if Israelis have to choose between these four, they would rather put their trust in the court than in the politicians or the rabbinate. So, as you can see, this too, of course, is explained in terms of the religious identity of the respondents. And as you can see, the ultra-Orthodox, which is the left column, the ultra-Orthodox have basically, 1% trust in the Supreme Court, 1%, whereas when you look at the secular Israelis, 52% have their utmost trust in the Supreme Court. Very interesting to see how the question of religious identity plays into so many of these other questions. So, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. That's the formula that was introduced into Israeli law in '92 in the closest Israel ever got to a Bill of Rights. So the Israel Democracy Index, which is done again annually by the Israel Democracy Institute, asks the question, or asked the question a number of times, what do you feel about this formula? Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. Should equal weight be given to each of these two components? Is the Jewish component too strong? Is the democratic component too strong? And what you see is, of course, that for the ultra-Orthodox, 59% of the ultra-Orthodox say democracy is overrated. We don't want that level of democracy. It interferes with a Jewish state. And of course, with the secular, it's exactly the opposite. 61% are saying the Jewish component is too strong. We want a democracy. The sad news here too is that whereas in the past, the majority felt that, yes, Israel is both Jewish and democratic and the two can be reconciled. But that is breaking down. Sad. And one of the contributions that American Jewry could make if it felt that it wanted to get into the sort of ideological, philosophical partnership in building Israel as a Jewish and democratic state could have contributed, because You know that Jewish and democratic are compatible, are mutually, they contribute to each other. But the sad reality is that the clash in Israel has been eroding that sense of the unity of Jewish and democratic. So here I mentioned before that there is a level of threat involved in the makeup of the Israeli political and religious formulas. So the Pew Research Center, and of course you know the Pew does overseas studies. In 2016, it published a major study on Israel's religiously divided society. So one of the questions they asked is, do you favor or oppose making, now they asked a different question of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So do you favor or oppose making for Jews halacha, the state law for Jews in Israel, namely a Torah state? For Muslims, Sharia, the official law for Muslims in Israel, and for Christians, the Bible, etc. So look at that. The ultra-Orthodox, 86% want Israel to be a Torah state and have Jewish law dictate, bind all Jews in Israel. For the secular, again, it's the reverse. 90% oppose it. So if you think that the core questions of what is Israel's identity, how does one reconcile religion and state, have died out, have sort of waned away since 1948, the truth is exactly the opposite. And what you see is this clash, which isn't just a clash of religion and state, it's a clash between a majority which is secular and traditional, not so religious, that are being railroaded by the ultra-Orthodox through their political clout playing the swing vote. Okay, I'll jump because I want to leave some time for questions. I'll jump to a couple of questions that I'm sure will be of interest to you. So how do Israelis feel, Israeli Jews, feel about equal recognition for the three major Jewish streams? You'll be glad to see consistently about 64-65% support equal rights, equal status for Reform and Conservative in Israel. And then how do Israelis identify themselves when you insist and ask them the question, not are you religious, traditional, or secular, or Haredi, religious, traditional, secular, but are you ultra-Orthodox, Zionist ultra-Orthodox? That's a new, so relatively new segment of Zionist orthodoxy. Zionist Orthodox, mainstream Zionist Orthodox, conservative, reform, or I don't identify as belonging to, affiliating with any of the streams. So the majority of Israelis, 57%, say, I don't identify with any of the streams, I'm just Jewish. The interesting thing is that you have 7% identifying, affiliating, not necessarily paying dues. No, they don't pay dues, and they are not members of synagogue. It's a very different picture than in the States. And I hope you have paid your dues, and if not, do that before Yom Kippur, very important. So 7% identify as Reform, and 6% identify as conservative. Now this is very significant, and this isn't just in our poll. The JPPI in 2018 published a book, The Rising Streams, about the streams of Judaism in Israel. And they, one of the things they show is 6 surveys that were done in recent years over how Israelis identify with Reform and Conservative. And as you can see, 4 out of the 6 surveys, and one of them is a survey that Hiddush did, show that between 11 and 13% of Israelis, Israeli Jews, between 11 and 13% of Israeli Jews identify themselves as Reform or Conservative. This is remarkable because this is light years away from the misguided notion in the 60s and the 70s, which was sort of translated into the phrase, the synagogue that the average Israeli Jew doesn't set foot in has to be Orthodox. It was misguided then, but what you can see now is this is a very different picture. When you bear in mind that only about 10% identify as ultra-Orthodox, you realize that there is already a segment that's slightly larger than the ultra-Orthodox that identifies Reform Conservative. The difference, of course, is that those who identify as Reform Conservative don't vote Reform Conservative, which is a good thing because we don't want people to vote, single-mindedly based on religious, edicts. This destroys the country. But in terms of understanding how far Israel has gone in embracing Reform and Conservative, you can see this here. And the last thing that I will share with you and then have a few minutes questions and answers is, we asked the question repeatedly because so many are saying, well, with all due respect to what you think, keep your thoughts to yourself and, by all means, support Israel, support it on the Hill, send your checks, etc. But don't try to get involved in fighting this battle in Israel. So we asked the question, do you support or oppose the involvement of diaspora Jewry, American Jewish leaders? We asked it in different ways, in advancing religious freedom in Israel, such as a freedom of marriage, such as doing away with the monopoly of the chief rabbinate, etc. And what you can see is, again, a clear, unequivocal response. 64% are saying, yes, we support and we invite and we embrace and appreciate diaspora American Jewish engagement in partnering with us in advancing religious freedom in Israel. Of course, if you ask the question, what about American Jewry or diaspora Jewry getting involved in setting up the borders of Israel, or in setting up the parameters for a peace agreement, or security requirements, etc., you'll find Israelis saying, gee, who's going to be affected by it first and foremost if what you say isn't going to work out? It's our children, it's us that are on the front line. So you will not find a similarly embracing and inviting response on security issues, etc. But when it comes to religious freedom, the overwhelming majority of Israelis support it, want it, and will welcome individual and group involvement, growing engagement with and support for the battle for advancing religious freedom in Israel. All right, I'll stop here. There are a few more things, but I'll leave that for you to read. And if you want to ask questions afterwards, after you read it, by all means, write me through your rabbi directly to me. And my email is on the first slide. And now I think we still have about 9 minutes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That was great, Uri. Oh my God, so much information. You're so good at this. I love it. So what questions do you all have that you'd love to have him answer? Not every day you get Uri Regev here, let me just tell you.
I want to have a suggestion of exactly what I can do as an individual right here in America to support the religious freedom in Israel.
Thank you so much for the question. Now, we have not met before, we have not spoken before, so I didn't set you up to ask the question, right?
No.
So there are a number of things that one can do. The simplest, the fastest, doesn't cost even a penny, is stand up and be counted in support of an alternative paradigm for Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, what I'll do is I'll email your rabbi a link to the vision statement on Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And it would be wonderful if Emanu-El as a congregation signed it, if you have not signed it yet, and that you urge over the high holidays every member of the congregation to sign it individually. The beautiful thing about this vision statement, which I wrote together with a leading modern Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Magat, a past president of the Rabbinic Council of America and the former, retired senior rabbi of the Sephardic Portuguese synagogue in New York. It is a concise, bold, unifying, alternative statement on all the major issues of religion and state. So far, you have leaders of Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Renewal, and leading Orthodox figures signing it, organizations signing it, etc. We have about 1,800 people that signed it. It should be 18,000, not 1,800. So that's the simplest thing. Two other things. Obviously, this is not a fundraiser. But the truth of the matter is, we don't get state support. And the ability to fight in the courts as we do, and we are fighting for women's representation, and we are fighting for non-Orthodox converts, and we are fighting now for the civil and pluralistic burial, and we have forced the army to change its rules and allow families in the sad situation where a soldier dies to be able not only to be served by the Orthodox military rabbinate, but to choose a non-Orthodox or secular, etc. Our ability to do that kind of advocacy, to do that kind of research, to do that kind of analysis depends on our ability to master resources. So those who can, this is a wonderful cause to support with clear benefits. But even if you can't, the issue is to get the American Jewish leadership to change their a mode of operation, which basically is keep us out of it. Well, so long as you keep out of it, obviously, things don't change. It is only when you come together, as you did on Soviet Jewry, when you come together loud, clear, constructive, that you can actually effect change. So the other is advocacy 101. If you're a member of Hadassah, if you have some leaders in Hadassah, get Hadassah to support freedom of marriage in Israel. Why don't they? Get the local federation to support our work. We have had a number of conversations with them. They should. Get the CRC to take a stand. Don't be intimidated by the claim that it's going to, raise controversy. Well, the controversy is killing Israel, is killing the Jewish people, because it is a controversy that ends up with submission to the ultra-Orthodox. We should reverse that trend. So advocacy 101, vision statement on Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and those who can support us financially.
That was great. Well done. Jeez. And by the way, everyone, he's in Israel right now, so it's 1 o'clock our time. Figure that out. So you can imagine how he is at 10 a.m. after a cup of coffee. This is light Uri you're getting. I just love your passion, Uri, so much. And I think supporting Hiddush would be fantastic for us. So I think that is something that we should all consider, as well as, I think for all of you that are on this call right now, I will send you, literally I'll send you through email what Uri has here, and he'll send me this other document that I'll send on to all of you as well. Is that okay? Anyone who doesn't want it, let me know. I'm just gonna go ahead and send it to all of you, this discussion. Any other questions? Well, I would love you to comment a little bit on kind of where are we going to go from here. For a lot of us, we're I want to try to be as respectful as I can, but you know, Netanyahu is Trump is Putin. They all seem to be very similar energies in terms of their power issues. And you know, with Netanyahu's situation, you're a lawyer. I mean, you've won cases for our movement over these years, Uri, in your background. What's your take on the fact that Netanyahu has all these cases against him and he still has support? I mean, is there any hope of him just getting out of the way?
First of all, we don't take sides in terms of partisan politics. We don't take sides not because we don't have opinions, but because one of the strategic sort of new approaches is that for too long, the battle for religious freedom has been colored as leftist. We want to be able to reach out to both political left and political right, and we have been able to. So, for instance, we created Hiddush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel. We have an executive committee member, Rabbi Asher Lopatin, past president of the Chovevei Torah Yeshiva, who is right-wing to the point that he doesn't even support a two-state solution. And we have leftists. You know, on our board, we have our treasurer, who is a board member of the Daniel Pipes, outfit, the Middle East Forum, and we have Stanley Gold, who is our chair, who has been a long-time supporter of Peace Now and the Israel Policy Forum, etc. So I won't take a stand, but I will say the following. Recent polls in Israel have consistently shown the shrinking of support of the Likud, and the most recent polls have shown that the Likud is, the potential right-wing coalition is under 61 seats. The most recent poll that was done showed that the sort of right-wing potential coalition only has 59. So I would say that politically, the shenanigans that we've been seeing taking place are taking their toll.
Good.
Now, when will the elections take place? Who is going to run? It's not entirely clear. Right. But I would not say that that which was is necessarily a sign of what will be. There is one thing that we need to understand. You know, you may be approached by well-meaning groups on the left that have told you V15, Darkeinu, you know, a number of attempts in recent elections. You know, let's resuscitate the left. Let's get this once, you know, regain the dominance, the prominence of the left. Unfortunately, in the next few years, that's not going to happen. And it goes back to the first slide that I shared with you. For a variety of reasons, at this point in the game, the majority Israelis are right of center, not center or left of center, which means that the most constructive way forward, which will impact both on a more moderate international policy and security policy and on issues of religious freedom, is a wide unity civil government, namely pressuring the right and the center to come down from their high horse, join forces, and create a wide-based civil coalition which will be able to disregard or keep out the ultra-Orthodox pressure. And as you could see, this isn't just an ultra-Orthodox pressure regarding religious issues, it's also pressure toward a more extreme right-wing policy. So I feel that there is a constructive way out that will resolve many of the predicaments that Israel is facing, but it will take goodwill, it'll take constructive pressure. And again, you know, much of the support for the Israeli political parties comes from American donors or Jewish donors from outside Israel. Hopefully, they will be using their financial support to impact on a more constructive, promising alternative on the political scene as well. All
Wow.
right.
That was good. That was really good, Uri. Oh my gosh, fantastic. So I'll send all of you the email of these slides that he used for his presentation. He only
And I
got
will
through maybe a
forward to you
quarter of
the-
them. What?
I will forward the link to the vision statement of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
Wonderful. And then I'll send it on to all of you. And thank you all for participating. And thank you, Uri, so much for spending this hour with us. And now go schluff, Bubby. Go schluff.